Well, let's get into the background then. I think I'm just so blown away because I really thought when this record came up, we were going to mostly shit on it. I have to be honest, audience.
I was looking forward to like really shitting on it. Yeah, it's just better than I had thought. But also, I mean, Morrison is a real douche, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And we're
And
we're gonna
he wears that like a crown.
yeah, and one might say he got his comeuppance for it. But
Yeah.
I saw a quote that I liked in this book I read that I wanted to preface the story with. I don't recall who exactly it's attributed to, some reviewer. They said, "The Beatles and the Stones are for blowing your mind. The Doors are for when your mind is already gone."
Is that a compliment?
It's a compound compliment.
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But let's talk about where Jim Morrison and the Doors came from. Let's get into the background here. So this story starts like all drug-addled megalomaniac stories. It starts in Florida. Now,
Florida
Of
man.
course.
Jim
Florida
hit
man drives car through the desert, eats peyote, forms the doors.
exactly. Jim is born in 1943 in a town called Melbourne, Florida. His dad is an admiral in the Navy, if you can believe that.
Dude,
So,
a legit war hero.
yeah,
That man flew dog fighting missions in a Hellcat over the Pacific for the entirety of World War II. He was shooting down Japanese Zeros with machine guns from a plane.
he ends up
That's
becoming
insane.
right, and you could just like imagine as we're telling Jim's story, the sort of culture clash within that house. Yeah, I read that his dad became the youngest rear admiral, which is above admiral, ever in the Navy at that point, at like in his late 40s. So,
Yeah, he was like a real legit. I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on him because there was always the rumor that he was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident and stuff like that and helped get the US into Vietnam. Apparently not true, but he was a badass. And I cannot imagine how pissed off at Jim he probably was all the time.
so because his dad's in the military, they end up moving around a lot. He doesn't stay in Florida, right? He spent some time in New Mexico as a kid. He ends up going to high school over in the Washington D.C. area. But he's from a fairly standard issue nuclear family. He's the oldest in the family. He's got a couple of younger brothers. Now, unlike a lot of rebellious drug-addled people, his dad was not he didn't have a bad childhood by most measures, right? His dad wasn't into hitting him, no corporal punishment, but he was unsurprisingly into discipline and dressing his sons down if they failed to meet his expectations. So we're talking more berating, public shaming kind of stuff in his youth. Now,
Probably the kind of stuff where like, it's baseball practice and your kid misses a couple of pitches and he starts crying and instead of comforting him, he's just yelling at him like, "You're the damn ball, Jim." He's like,
Give me 3 laps.
yeah, exactly.
yeah, probably some of that. So, one of the moments in Jim's life that I read about that he considered a seminal turning point is he's around 5 or 6 years old, and the family is driving through the New Mexico desert, and they come upon a horrific accident on the side of the road. It's like an overturned truck that had been carrying Native American migrant workers, and they get there shortly after the accident has happened, and there are bodies scattered, dead and bleeding all over the road. And they stop to help.
Jesus God.
And this affected Jim, unsurprisingly. One, he realizes that his father, who's in the car and stops the car, he doesn't know what's going on. And so he says it's his first taste of fear. He feels fear because he knows his parents, even his dad, who's always in control, is not in control. And he also later said that he was convinced that one of those Native American souls of one of those dead men was who was running around, kind of like hopped into him and became his somehow merged with him. So he's convinced of that from a young age.
Dark passenger.
That's just the self-importance again of like, oh yes, one of these souls must have latched onto me. That can only explain why I am the way that I am. And anyway, I'm gonna try not to shit on Jim Morrison too much during this.
I'm on the fence because to be honest, he comes off his antics later in life come off as really, really boorish and unforgivable in many ways, and we're gonna get to that. But to hear people tell it, he's got this whole Jekyll and Hyde persona where he actually is a really intellectual kid. So going back to his childhood, right? He gets good grades consistently. He's rebellious. He acts out in class. He's a bit of a class clown. You know, he likes attention. No huge surprise there, but he's a really good student. In fact, he loves going to the library, reading books. He reads poetry from a young age. He looks up to poets instead of looking up to musicians or actors like other kids. He's a chubby nerd, right? Who goes and reads philosophy texts.
Wow, just letting his dad down from day one then, huh?
Exactly, exactly. And they talk about how he sees and finds really interesting this disparity of his father, who has all this immense power when he's at work. Like he takes Jim out to an aircraft carrier where he's in charge, basically. But then he sees also his father go home and he gets yelled at by his mother for not taking out the trash. And he thinks that like that disparity is just really, really interesting. That sticks with him.
That
That
is tough to square, I would imagine.
For his dad, I would imagine. Telling him, like, you know that I can launch nuclear missiles from the ships that I drive around.
yeah, no respect, no respect. So like I said, he's a bookish young kid, internal, introspective kid. He's reading Nietzsche and stuff in high school, which is a very heady read, even at our advanced ages. And I think throughout the book, what you hear that from the people who knew him is, yeah, he was a wild man. He was really hard to deal with at times, but he was also this like sensitive, really engaging, intellectual person who, when he wasn't drunk or on acid, you know, he could be extremely compelling and engaging. He could kind of stop a room just with his presence, and he was also kind of unafraid to put himself out there, right? So it is this black and white Jekyll and Hyde day and night thing.
I will say the charisma that he has is palpable on the tape. You can tell that he is going to be engaging live performing this. You can almost picture him in the booth, shirtless with his leather pants on, belting out some of these songs, and it's compelling. It is very compelling.
No, I agree with that. I mean, he sounds like a handsome man, right? And there's absolutely something about his delivery, maybe even similar to like Amy Winehouse or something, where like you can just tell from the delivery that this is a pretty fluid, that this is jazz, right? Like this isn't coming out exactly the same way every time. This isn't overworked by any stretch.
Yeah. So going back to Jim's story, he comes of age, he goes to community college briefly, then he goes to Florida State University in like 1960, which I don't know if it was a party school back then, but I assume so. Quickly realizes that's not for him, and instead he decides to enroll in UCLA Film School. And part of the decision is he wants to get away, I think, from his family. And part of it's that he's reading people like Freud, and he believes in this, that film has this ultimate ability to manipulate people's subconscious desires, right? And that really appeals to him.
Back in the day when you could just decide you want to go to UCLA Film School on a whim and just go there, and it was also free back then. Like, good Lord, the possibility of getting into UCLA nowadays is like 1 in 800 or something like that. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it was wild. And LA
Different
and
times.
yeah, the US was just really different, right? And it's about to change as we know. So, okay, so he wants to study film, but perhaps unsurprisingly to you guys, he didn't really want to learn the basics of like camera work or editing. Those details of the craft were completely boring to him. He's more there as an art student, wanting to find a way to express some deep underlying aspect of the human condition, almost like a performance artist, even in his mind, right? And as I said before, this does not sound like a guy that any of us want to hang out with at any age. But the good news is he's at UCLA and he meets Ray Manzarek. Ray is a couple years older. He's already well respected at the film school. Like people in his class think, hey, Ray is the guy who's going to go on and actually do something. He's a really good student, really smart guy. And of course, we know he's a piano player. He's the organ player in the Doors. But while he's there, Jim also finds another best bud, drugs. Now, because what's interesting is that maybe part of growing up in a military household, perhaps just part of the culture at the time where drugs were not a normal thing, he came to LA with a fairly straight edge attitude. He had too much pride for drugs. But between this cultural revolution of the 1960s plus the folks he's meeting, it's too convincing, right? So they talk about how in the early 60s, when he's at UCLA, the neuropsychiatric department was conducting studies on LSD. And at this time, LSD was still pretty new and still completely legal substance, right? This is the early 60s.
Well, yeah. Who is the actor that was like getting dosed constantly? Warren. Man, I'll get back to it.
Well,
Warren G. Harding.
Ken Kesey was one of those people who took a lot in these early tests. Anyway, side note, I looked it up. Did you know that LSD wasn't actually made illegal until October of 1968? That feels powerfully late.
It does. Yeah. So that's like, what, Summer Love of 67?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
Cary
they're like, all
Grant.
these people are having fun and fucking, we got to stop this.
Oh, Cary Grant took a lot of acid.
Yeah, it was part of like a guided therapy.
Well,
Macro dosing on the
it
daily.
really was.
Yeah.
It's coming back
50s.
around now, but it really was thought of differently then. It was a new discovery. The government, of course, and scientists were trying to figure out how they could use it. Government wanted to weaponize it. And anyway, so they needed
You
student
know, I saw a
volunteers.
special on the Robert Kennedy assassination just the other night, and they talked about this and Sirhan, and was he like a CIA?
Oh,
Yes.
a Manchurian candidate via
Yeah.
LSD. You know,
No,
how
he was-
many
he-
times are we going to reference Sirhan on this fucking podcast?
He's like a sleeper cell. Yeah, no, he was like a CIA sleeper cell that was like, he was like dosed, and then they triggered him somehow.
Yeah,
That's
I
what-
We
get
talking
it.
one
Sirhan
of the
Sirhan here,
theories.
my boy?
Yeah.
Yeah, he comes up week over week over week, as we know. He's contractually obligated to get a mention on every episode. So anyway, so they would go down as student volunteers. They'd sign up under fake names. They'd take a free dose of LSD. Then an hour later, they'd try to play it as straight as possible. When the researchers came back, and be like, "I feel nothing," and they'd give them another hit of LSD. And then they'd go back the next day and just use different names. And they basically took acid constantly for free.
Were the researchers just like super cool? They're like, dude, it's clearly they hit Jim Morrison with a fake mustache and nose or something.
I think that it was such a time where they really had no clue what it did, because the people who were administering it certainly had never tried it themselves. And so it was all really mysterious, right? This is a lot happened quickly with our understanding of it. But I like this quote too. Jim is quoted as saying, I thought you would like this in particular, Phil: "Drugs are a bet with your mind."
Yeah, I feel like I remember that from the. I feel like that's in the movie. Does
possible.
it does sometimes? It just feels like it's like a roller coaster.
Yeah, he's not wrong. He's
Yeah.
not wrong. Yeah.
He just
But once
happened
you're
to lose
strapped
that
in,
bet eventually.
Once you're strapped in, you can't get out. Until the ride's over.
Well, just listen, just quick digression into our own drug experimentation. We've all tried it, maybe even several times, and had a great time. And I would advocate it generally. But the idea of taking it day after day after
That's a
day,
terrible idea.
That's a terrible. That sounds
horrible.
insane.
Yeah,
That-
yeah, you're gonna
I'm-
have some side effects from that.
I'm convinced that could certainly drive you insane.
Yes. Or at least uncover a lot of underlying psychosis that may have never manifested.
Yeah, or reduce inhibitions that really should be there in polite society, right?
Yes.
Yeah, something. Yeah, you can't spend that much time like detached from reality, and and not
So-
have it impact your perception of actual reality.
So I'm just saying it because I was kind of flabbergasted by these accounts of just how much acid Jim Morrison took and how frequently he took it. But we'll get into that as the antics ensue and as the band forms. But back to music, right? Ray Manzarek at school is in a band with his brothers. The band is called Rick and the Ravens, even though there's no one in the band called Rick. And him and his brothers all grew up in Chicago playing music together. Now they're in California. Ray is the singer of this band as well as the keys player. And he's got a brother on harmonica and he's got another brother on guitar. And the other film students would go to shows, of course, to support them. And one night, Jim jumps on stage. And at this point, it should be noted that Jim cannot sing a lick. He can't shake a tambourine. He can't even clap along correctly to the music. But damn it, the kid's got it. Whatever it is. And Ray files it away that this weirdo Jim, who's into poetry and has a lot of charisma and is just a singular individual, there might be something interesting there, but nothing comes of it just yet.
I think we know what it is, which is very good bone structure and a flat stomach. Basically, that's what he had.
Apparently, he was still a little chubby at this point. He kind of had a weight problem for most of his life until after college. We're going to get to it, where basically because he was starving, he got really skinny.
Oh, okay, good.
But in any case, he did have charisma. They said consistently, he was just the kind of person who could hold a room really effortlessly, right? So school was winding down. Jim, like I said, he graduates later than Ray, but as Jim is getting ready to graduate, he is talking a big game about moving to New York City. He wants to make films, but instead, he just ends up hanging around LA. And the summer after college, he's broke. He does not want a job. So he ends up, get this, living on an abandoned office building rooftop in Venice in the summer of 1965. And what does he do up there, you might ask? He does acid alone, like every day, multiple times a day.
Wow. Just pissing off the side of that building all day long.
Just stared at the sky. I just thought that was insane. So I guess Venice in the LA area was sort of like the Haight-Ashbury of LA around this time. It was a hippie enclave of sort. And this is where Jim actually writes a lot of what would become the lyrics on this album, which he thinks of as poetry at the time. So the rooftop, as I can understand it, was kind of like his walkabout, because he's just up there for 3 months. And the way it's described in the book, he literally takes multiple hits of acid every day by himself. He's
gonna be like eating meals on acid then?
This is where they talk about how, like, because when you take psychedelics, you tend to not have an appetite, and he had no money for food. He spent all the money, it seems like, on drugs. So that's where he gets skinny. He also grows his hair long at this point. And again, you got to think about the culture is, quickly or slowly at first, but then quickly going to be shifting into this hippie movement, but it's still just starting.
I didn't think about it until right now, but if you ever wanted to like transform yourself into a hippie, taking 270 hits of acid on a rooftop over a 90-day period is a pretty good way to get it done. Right?
Yeah.
By yourself. I just think that's an important detail. It's not like he's not hanging out having a good time with his friends.
I can't even begin to speculate what day 3 is like, let alone day 88.
Yeah, we just like, I gotta take more God damn, just taking the acid. Like, oh God.
I hope he had some shelter from the sun up there. I hope there was like a little something.
Well, we'll never know how his moisturization skin turned out, because he died so damn young.
Yeah.
But okay, at the end of that summer, pretty much, he runs into Ray Manzarek on the beach just randomly, and they catch up because they knew each other at school. And Jim ends up reading him some of the lyrics he's written.
Ray's like, "Hey man, what have you been up to?
Lose some weight?
You actually look great, man. You got a nice tan. You're looking trim and fit. Your pupils are the size of dinner plates. What's going on?"
Right. And so Ray's like, "Wow, you wrote this stuff. This is really cool. Let's start a band. Like, let's do it. I'm already in this band. We could kind of use more songs. This is an interesting." I think what Ray is thinking at that moment is it's a great mixture of poetry set to rock and roll music, which is not happening at that time. That's a pretty new thing. Phil, did your light go out or something?
No. The sun is set here and I didn't have a light on. Hold on a second.
Did the night divide the day? Is that what happened there, Phil?
Yeah, the night severed the day. And I've had to go to the man-made light.
There we go.
Okay, so in addition to inviting him to join the band or be in the band, at first Jim is thinking like, yeah, obviously you're going to sing the songs. You're the singer. I cannot sing. But Ray is the one who really believes that Jim can be a singer and a front man. Even though now, like I said, he's charismatic, but he's pretty shy. He's more a one-to-one guy. He's not a hold court in the whole room kind of guy. And Ray's like, you wrote this stuff, you have to sing it. It'll mean more. This is the vision for the band. It's really coming from Ray Manzarek. I will, this is Ray talking to Jim. I will work with you. I will help you practice. We'll get you there. Let's do it.
To give Ray some credit, the realization that it's hard to be a front man from behind an organ is a good self-awareness to have, that like I probably can't carry the stage if I'm tethered to an organ the entire time. And then also, what did Jim think he was going to do in the band? If he was like, I'm going to join your band, I just write the words and that's it. Like that hadn't been a modality yet, right? The Dead weren't even doing that yet, were they?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Maybe all this happened at exactly the same time, but I think one of the things that Ray sees sort of immediately is that it's very different from the stuff that's popular. It's almost the antithesis of flower power and surf music, which is what's popular in 1965 in California. It's way darker and moodier just based on his lyrics, right?
I
And
mean, it definitely has a darkness to it. It definitely has the dark side of hippiedom, right? Like the AK-47 carrying hippies, right?
Yeah, dude. I mean, living on a roof, pissing in a bucket is not going to make you think sunshine and lollipops. You know, you might be a little bit angry about some
Maybe he had
stuff.
some guns up there, just for sake of argument. Let's say he had some guns up there.
now,
Okay.
perhaps this is an obvious thing to mention, but quick digression on the ages of these guys. I suppose it's because people like Jim Morrison died young and are legendary in part because of that. But I never tend to think about people like him or Janis Joplin or Hendrix as boomers, but they are. And they actually could still be alive today had they not been taken
Yeah.
from us, which is an interesting thought to
Yeah.
think, right?
Well, because Ray Manzarek only died like a few years ago, right? I feel like he
Yeah.
played like Bonnaroo or something one year.
Dude, Jim Morrison could be around having real shitty takes on modern politics, and we can keep destroying his legacy by the minute on Twitter.
Oh man, could you imagine Jim Morrison
Oh,
squaring off with Cat Scratch Fever?
oh, with Ted Nuge, the
Yeah, with
Nuge.
the Nuge, yeah.
This would actually be an interesting. Somebody out there that's listening to this, start up the Jim Morrison Twitter account with just random acid for 90 days on a rooftop Jim Morrison musings.
Yeah. So they start this band, and Ray is going around telling friends from film school that know both of them. He's like, "Oh, I'm in a band with Jim Morrison," and they are invariably like, "Why? Why did you subject yourself to that? What is the plan?" So again, the idea is that Jim's just going to join the existing Rick and the Ravens, and they'll work on some of his tunes. But Ray really is insistent on Jim practicing, figuring out how to sing, figuring out how to be a frontman. Now, another weird facet of this band, Rick and the Ravens, is there's no consistent drummer. They always just have to get a pickup drummer for the gig. So now that Ray's getting a little more serious, school's over, he feels like he has someone who's written some good songs. They work on getting a committed drummer. Ray meets John Densmore, the drummer in the Doors, at a Maharishi Mahesh yogi session in LA. Now, this
As
is,
one does.
as one does, this is pre-Beatles fame, but this is the same guy that the Beatles went to India with. And he's already a bit of a meditation celebrity at this time. And I thought this anecdote was funny because Ray meets him at one of these classes. He hears he's a drummer. He asks him to join the band. Densmore's like, yeah, sure, whatever. I guess, what does that mean? Sure. And Ray's like, okay, cool. I'll get back to you in a few months because, the time's not right now. What the fuck does that mean?
Yeah. Then why'd you fucking ask, man? Yeah.
Man, I really feel like I could have made it happen if I lived in LA in the 1960s. I feel like, that was the time and place for a huckster like me.
Well, and Ray Manzarek was seen as like the serious one, the studious one, and he's like, I need a couple of months to get it together enough to have a drummer join my band.
I got to catch up to Jim on all these hits of acid. So Densmore, by the way, is from a jazz background. He grows up listening to Elvin Jones and Art Blakey, but it's some point right around when he meets Ray Manzarek, he starts getting some session work for rock music, and it's like, oh, I'm clearly going to go in the direction that is paying me money. So Rick and the Ravens now as a drummer, they managed to get a small record deal and release a single, but big surprise, it does absolutely nothing. In fact, it costs the label money. So even though the contract that they signed offers to print and distribute a second single by Rick and the Ravens, they instead decide to offer the band free studio time to do whatever they want if they agree to cancel the contract, which they take them up on. Now, during this time, Jim is practicing. He's getting better at singing. He's getting a little more confident, and they decide it's time to change their name. This is one of the things that Jim had come up with on the roof when he's going deep into the desert of his mind. He decided that his eventual band would be called The Doors. Now, people probably know this, but I'll just say it in case you don't. It's originally lifted from a William Blake poem that goes like this: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite. And of course, in addition to that, this phrase was used in an influential book from 1954 by Aldous Huxley called The Doors of Perception, which is more or less a diary account of the author taking psychedelic drugs. And it's actually a great read. I read it in college, but it's really interesting. It's Aldous Huxley, who also wrote Brave New World. It's an interesting example, early example of kind of a quote unquote square person, a respected author doing something counterculture and talking about it. So on this second go around, they go back into the studio for the free studio time. They are called The Doors officially. They sound nothing like The Doors, though. There's a harmonica player in the band. Ray is playing piano instead of organ. No one really wants anything to do with this single. They shop it around a bunch. And like I said, it is the complete opposite of Fun in the Sun, which is what's really big right now. Except,
frankly, harmonica is a hard sell on a rock album. Nobody got it right until Blues Traveler, basically, all those years later. But it's tough to make the harmonica work in that setting.
yeah, well, it's coming off of being a blues band, you know? So it probably had a much more bluesy turn because if you think about it, Ray is a very stride, like a blues piano kind of player. And that's what enables him to have all those interesting, intricate left hand parts in the first place. So then the harmonica kind of works with that. But they obviously shift as time goes on, right? Densmore's a little jazzier. He brings in some Latin elements, and the eventual guitar player kind of has a flamenco background. He plays only with his fingers, stuff like that. So they shop it around to a bunch of places. Almost no one wants it, but Columbia Records, the Columbia talent guy, liked the idea, liked the story that they were from UCLA, that they were film students. He figures it's kind of an interesting angle, and so he signs them again. And because Columbia at that moment owns Vox, the instrument manufacturer, they immediately give Ray a new organ. Right away, he gets a new Vox organ, and that ends up being the signature sound of The Doors, right? And the guys are like super stoked. They're like, we have finally made it. And then nothing happens. No recording, no press. Their contract is there, but it completely languishes. It completely languishes. No one in-house at Columbia is interested in them other than the talent guy who signed them, but he can't convince anyone to actually put the work in. They like keep stopping by the office, but there's no news. Months go by. It's a weird situation because they've been signed theoretically by a huge record label, and yet they hear nothing. No one, there's no scheduling of anything, right? So
Luckily, Ray didn't pawn that Vox organ to try to get some money to live on.
seriously, yeah, seriously. So, and they're pretty broke at this time. But interestingly, this is a seminal moment because Ray's brothers, after a couple months of nothing happening, they're over it. They're like, we're quitting. We're going back to Chicago to get real jobs. So they start looking for other players, or at least a guitar player, right? They need someone else in the band. Now, Densmore had actually grown up in LA with Robbie Krieger, the guitar player in The Doors. So they asked him to join a band that technically already has a recording contract with Columbia. So it's like a pretty easy choice for Robbie Krieger, one would think. Now, like I said, he grew up playing not rock, but flamenco. So he's definitely more classically trained. And I did think it was interesting. Watch a video of him that he never uses a pick. So even though there's no bass player in this band, Tom, at least the guitar player eschews the pick.
Yeah, there we go. I know I like their sound.
Now, as they tell it, the very first time the four of these guys play together, it just clicks. It feels right. Ray is playing bass with his left hand on the Vox organ at this point, but they know it's not ideal. They audition some bass players, but no one ever clicks with them. It takes away from some of the sparseness and what they liked about their sound. And then one day, Ray sees a Fender Rhodes bass piano in the store. It gets great bass sound. Plus, since the Vox organ is flat on top, he can just sit one on top of the other and play two different instruments effectively, two keyboards with each hand.
Match made in heaven.
Indeed.
You know, I never thought about it until right now, but like because there's four people in the band, but it is sort of like a power trio lineup, right? Again, no bass player, no typical bass player, but like again, that sparseness, you know,
Yeah, and that
is
really
from the
it works for them.
smaller makeup. Yeah.
Yeah, it absolutely works for them. It is an interesting sound because of that. I think they must have been at least somewhat aware of that it was just a little bit more original to keep it in that configuration, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So
I got to
nothing's
imagine every fucking show, guys would come up to him and be like, "Hey, you know what? You know I play the bass, right? So I could like, I just like you in your band,
Yes.
right? Like I could be tomorrow. I could be in your band, right?
I already know the songs.
Yeah. It's not that hard. It's the bass.
so nothing's happening with the recording contract, and they decide they need to get jobs because they need to eat. They're nearly starving at this point. They audition for every bar on the Sunset Strip, and one of the dingiest, crappiest ones ends up hiring them. It's a bar called the London Fog. Now, for people who maybe aren't familiar with LA, the Sunset Strip has a long history of being a cool place with lots of bars, lots of music going on. It's still where, for instance, the Comedy Store, the original Comedy Store, is. And it's just this huge, long street that cuts across Hollywood right at the top, right before he gets into the Hollywood Hills. It's still a very active place. I think we probably talked about it in the Guns N' Roses episode, even in the 90s, right? It was like the cool place to be in LA. So they get a gig for 5 sets a night, 4 nights a week.
Ooh.
We're talking 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. And I'm pretty sure I read that they were making $25 per man per week for that.
Jesus. It's like $1 a set.
Yeah, pretty much, right? But they could eat for free at the bar.
Oh,
They got
okay.
fed.
Right, exactly.
Do
So
they
that was-
also get to drink themselves into oblivion for free?
You know, it's an interesting question. I assume not, but it seems like Jim always has ways to get drunk, so maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Because I got to tell you, there's been many a show that we've played that we've lost money on because we just spent the meager money that they gave us at the bar that we were at. If the people are not going to give you free drinks, so I could see that being a money losing proposition for
I've
Jim.
definitely been negative on probably more than half of the shows I've
Oh,
played.
I mean, it doesn't take much. When you're only getting paid $15 at the end of the night, it only takes
Yeah,
3
yeah.
drinks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really important to their development because they're getting on stage, they're working things out. And for like long periods of time, they have a lot of time to fill, right? And in these early days, absolutely no one is coming. Jim is still singing with his back to the crowd. But for some reason, the owner's like, fuck it, let's do 2 more nights. Let's see what happens. And they take it.
7
Now,
nights a week.
they're now playing 6 out of 7
Oh,
nights a
6
week.
out of 7. Okay, Jesus.
Right. On admittedly, on the Sunset Strip, the famous Sunset Strip. Now, admittedly, it's not one of the cool places. They're playing for like 4.5 hours every night. But this is where the act really comes together that we hear on this record, right? There's no real pressure to perform. There's no audience at first. They vamp endlessly. They improvise lyrics, antics, you name it. Their whole aura as a band kind of comes together during these months where they're playing these shows to no one. So the Columbia contract was for 6 months. And right as that's about winding up, Columbia's not doing anything. They asked to be released. Columbia says, okay, you can be released. That was a bad financial decision on Columbia's part.
Yeah, Columbia's in the negative because they gave them an organ. So they're down 1 organ and they didn't get all the Doors catalogs. Come on, guys.
And during this period, like I said, they're playing constantly. They're developing songs. The antics are ensuing. Slowly but surely, they're developing a reputation. People are starting to come check them out. Jim's on-stage behavior is erratic and wild, but that is the point. And also during this time, between sets, Jim's always going over to the much more popular Whiskey A Go-Go, the cool bar, and he's chatting up the female booker there, trying to get them in. And now, in a stroke of completely dumb luck, there's a bar fight that Morrison gets into during one of their sets at the London Fog. They get fired from one bar, but somehow miraculously hired by the Whiskey A Go-Go within a couple nights of that. So now they're in the scene for real.
Just
but-
had to get in a fight.
Just had to get in a fight. But
Yeah.
quick reality check, band still remarkably broke. I read that Jim Morrison is sleeping under the boardwalk at this point.
That's
Ooh.
basically my worst nightmare.
Yeah.
I'm sure he has money for
take that,
acid, though.
you take that over the top of an abandoned office building.
Right, that was some hobo moved in there. He had to
Seriously.
No, I'd
move
have
out.
to see the top of that office
The
building.
lease was up. Right.
Yeah, at least in the office building, you know, wake up with like sand in your crotch every morning.
It's a toss up. Do you want shade ever, or do you want crabs
Wake up
crawling in your crotch?
Covered in dew, backed up by birds that think you're dead.
So once they get to the whiskey, that's when things really start happening. They start opening for Love, and Love's record label is called Elektra. And Elektra president Jack Holtzman sees them one night and hates them. But because they play so freaking often, he sees them 3 more times, and then he decides they're the next big thing. And suddenly it's been building, right? But suddenly there's a lot of interest. Frank Zappa at one point expresses interest in producing them. Sonny and Cher offer them a deal with their production company, but in their deal, they want to take 75% of the publishing rights.
Ooh.
Now, which is crazy. Elektra is a small label, and as we covered somewhat on the Love episode, they had started out and were only recently a folk label. They were releasing stuff by Phil Oakes and Judy Collins, but they're just starting to transition to this hipper music, and they actually have a fair amount of foresight in a way that a lot of labels didn't have about the change that was about to happen in the music scene, right, in the young music scene. So they offer $5,000 for new equipment for the band, plus only ask for 5% of the publishing rights.
Damn.
And interesting point that I read that the song that convinced label head Jack Holtzman to sign them was Alabama Song.
Really?
Yeah, it's interesting,
Okay.
right? Yeah, we're gonna get to it. We're gonna get to it.
Inexplicable, one might say.
Inexplicable. So, okay, but turns out the Doors were somewhat savvy about signing or not signing the wrong deal, and this is in part because of the Columbia experience that had made them a little gun shy, and in part because Robbie Krieger actually came from money, and his father kind of helped shepherd them through this part of the Doors Inc., right? But nothing's that simple. They signed the deal on a Wednesday, and Jim just decides to not show up for the next gig. They went to his house, and apparently he had taken, and I can't even believe I read this, but he had taken something like 100 hits of acid, and it was just like a statue.
For any of the people listening at home, that's way too much.
Yeah.
Like way, way too much.
Well,
I've always had this thing where, like, if you get too drunk on a fucking Wednesday, you still got to go to work on Thursday, because it's not like you don't know you didn't have work on Thursday when you got too drunk on a Wednesday night. If you know you have a gig, you don't take 100 hits of acid. You just don't do that.
Now we're just comparing, drugs to each other. 100 hits of acid, like if it was in an alcohol dose, would certainly be death.
Oh, yeah.
yes.
Certainly be death.
And-
There'd be no
and-
work tomorrow. You'd be
Well,
dead.
and not only that, but for those who don't know about the biological aspects of some of these things, whereas alcohol has a linear dose response curve. As you drink each successive beer, you have a somewhat linear response in your body to how drunk you are. LSD has an exponential response curve, meaning it's like a multiplicative effect that shoots you right up into, I don't even know where he was, but he was riding a snake somewhere.
Yeah, for sure.
Jesus.
But anyway, I think part of it is that Jim realizes fairly early on that it's because of his chicanery. And, that's why the crowds love him. They partly love that because he's so wild and unpredictable, and you never know what he's going to do. And later they talk about how in shows, like, they have this one show later at the Hollywood Bowl where, like, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones come to see them. It's this big show for them in their hometown. And Jim, for once, doesn't get super drunk and plays it really straight. And they give what some people say is a great show because they sounded really good, but fans are, like, noticeably disappointed that it's not wilder and more off the rails. So
it's like Probably like if you like hang out with the guys from Jackass and they're just like, yeah, let's just like have a beer, man. Let's just be cool. You're like, no, I want you to see you staple parts of your
You
body.
guys
Like, what
want
the
to?
fuck?
I'm getting Papa John's. You guys want any
Yeah,
pizza? You
exactly.
know?
Like you're gonna shove it up your butt. Like, what are you gonna do? Come on.
Yeah, this is so disappointing. So now, okay, we're nearing the end of our story. We're only telling the Doors story up to and including their debut album tonight, and thus saving a lot of their career and Jim's eventual tragic death for another show, since the Doors actually have two more albums on the 1001 list. But let me tell you, in case it's not already clear, Jim Morrison, even before he had fame and power, was a bit of a wild man, especially when he got the sauce into him. Now, throughout their tenure as a band, Jim would go on stage drunk out of his mind. People around this time said they'd see him wandering around the Sunset Strip between sets, bumping into telephone poles, clearly blitzed on acid. Which brings us to our favorite segment. It's the Jim Morrison's Drunken Antics by the Numbers.
Excellent.
I love it. I need a
So-
beer for this one. Hold on a
Okay.
second.
Okay, number 10 is the first number I want to throw out to you. That is the number of times Jim was arrested in his career as a frontman for the Doors. He loved inciting crowds to fight. He loved to antagonize police officers directly. He liked being arrested, one might say.
Wasn't he the first rock star to ever be arrested on stage?
Which brings me to my next number, number one.
Goddamn.
He was the first performer to be arrested in the middle of his set on stage in New Haven, Connecticut in November of 1967, which is the year this album came out. Okay, next number, 32.
What was he arrested for? I feel like they covered this in the movie. It was like was he like showing people?
Just a big misunderstanding. He was just being cool, and the cops were just assholes.
Yeah, I feel
Yeah,
like he was like
I-
whipping his junk out in the shows as part of.
I don't think he ever actually did that. I think that's a myth, but he could whip up a crowd. So I think probably a lot of times police officers were standing by, and it could have been about him saying or them perceiving he said an obscenity, or it could be about something he kind of did and got
This-
the crowd riled up, something.
Well, there was an incident that happened before that performance where he was with a young lady backstage, and a cop basically, they were like making out or something. And the cop came by, didn't know that he was performing that night, and was like, hey, get out of here, break it up. And he basically tells the cop to go fuck himself. And the cop maces him. And then so Jim's all super pissed off. They go on stage, and he's already like talking a bunch of shit about the cops while they're on stage. So then the cops start to surround the stage, and one of them comes out and he's like putting the mic in his face, like, what do you want to say? What do you want to say? And they're like, well, I'm just gonna beat your ass and fucking arrest you. How about that? Because this is the 60s and I can do whatever I want because I'm a cop.
Yeah, they talked about how he goes to jail. I think it's that night or one of the other nights. Probably happened multiple times, and it's some small town county jail. And he continues to antagonize the officers while he's in the cell. And they're like, hey, man, we're getting off at midnight and we will kill you. Like, we're seriously considering killing you and dumping your body in the swamp. And he ends up getting somebody to bail him out like right before that. But they talk about how back then, you know, today, if something like that happened, you'd have lawsuits, you'd have a whole follow up, you'd have an expose. It was just normal behavior almost for that kind of stuff to happen with small town police.
Yeah. Well, there was nothing on camera either. Like nowadays, everything was just recorded. They're like, there's no evidence that we took him to the jail. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and this was a
Sorry.
period where if you had long hair, you were already guilty of something.
Yeah. To be fair, he probably was guilty.
I'm
Just
sure.
to be fair. Yeah.
Okay, next number, 32. As in 32 Mai Tais at a Honolulu bar, which apparently set a record, understandably, a record for most Mai Tais ever drank in one sitting.
Okay, I got an immediate hypothesis there. If he's raged on acid, the Mai Tais aren't going to affect him at all.
Right.
So-
Right.
Frankly, I'd just be worried about the amount of sugar that you're consuming with 32 Mai Tais. Like, it's an unhealthy amount of sugar.
Not
let
going to
alone
say
alcohol.
skinny for long.
Exactly.
yeah.
It's funny because it seems like he wasn't into drugs other than the two we've mentioned, alcohol and acid. It seems like he mostly stayed away, or maybe even entirely stayed away from smoking pot, pills, and heroin for the most part. He just really was attracted to these two things.
Yeah. They vibrated. They resonated with him.
Well, just the fact that, listen, I'm not saying it's like good or anything. But like somebody at 27 dies of a heroin overdose, you can understand that. Somebody at 27 has effectively drank themselves to death over the course of the last 7 years. That's kind of hard to square. You're like, Jesus, how did you do that to your body in that period of time?
Yeah, he could take a lot of punishment. It sounds like people were kind of consistently blown away by how much he could put in his body and still be standing. Which brings me to our next number 2. That is the number of times Janis Joplin walloped him over the head with a liquor bottle to end a skirmish. Now, first time was they met at a Hollywood party. They got trashed together. But while Janis got more charming as she got drunker, Jim became more of an ogre. So by the time she was leaving, he grabbed her hair as she got into her car, and she, resourcefully, I might add, grabbed a handy liquor bottle, smacked him over the head with it, and he slept on the front lawn that night.
So, to be clear, though, she is ripped.
Yes.
With a liquor bottle in hand, hopping into her car.
Correct.
Like, doop-a-doop-a-doop. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I pictured the bottle might have been in her glove compartment, like that was the roadie. Second time it happened was in New York the following year, where Jim went to see Hendrix play in the Village.
You guys are tight now.
Well, I got confused with Hendrix, but of course, Jim can't just sit quietly and watch Jimi Hendrix play. He's an insatiable attention whore. So while Jimmy is soloing, he gets up on stage, he drops to the floor, he wraps his arms around Jimmy's legs and starts screaming to perform sexual acts upon him. Now, luckily, Janis was in the audience and again kerplunked him with a liquor bottle, and it was lights out for Jim.
I just love the fact that Janis just always has that handy liquor bottle. She's
Yes.
just 24/7 rolling around.
Leave you to speculate on why those liquor bottles were always handy to Miss Janis. Yes. But to be clear, none of that matters at all, because in 1967, 75% of all record singles and 45% of all LPs were purchased by girls aged 12 to 17. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but Jim Morrison is a bit bewitching looks-wise.
He's a handsome man.
Yeah.
He's a
And he's
good-looking
dangerous.
young guy.
Gonna piss your dad off that you like this guy.
And speaking of handsome devils who buy into their own hype, we love doing this show every week. We put a lot
we
of
have YouTube now. They can see what we look like.
we put a lot of work into it. We try to entertain you while informing you. We love you for listening every single week. It really does mean a lot. And if you want to take this relationship a step further, there's some simple ways to do it. And I assure you, we won't emerge from the wings to conk you over the head when you try these. Just leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. Share this podcast with a friend and consider joining our growing Patreon community. You can, as always, join for free, and every week we've been posting about the shows we release. We continue the conversation in the comments, plus you can vote on some of the upcoming episodes, submit your own tweet-length reviews, and of course, if you care to chip in $5 a month, you can access several hours now of bonus content, including our latest song battle, the best one-hit wonders of the 1970s. Regardless,
I have to add on that I feel like the comments on Patreon have gotten really good lately, and our fans have really good shit to say. There's interesting factoids in there and good discussions, and so that in and of itself is worth the visit.
Totally agree. And that's one of the really cool parts about it is as that community has started to emerge, people getting in there, chopping it up, agreeing with us, disagreeing with us, like Tom said, adding really interesting context and funny jokes as well. So definitely check out Patreon. It's linked, of course, in the show notes. But listen, regardless of how you choose to do it, we love all the support you give us and just wanted to say thank you. And now we're at the recording of The Doors' self-titled debut. They recorded this at Sunset Sound in LA. It is totally done on a 4-track. And for the most part, as we've mentioned, it is live, including the vocals. Now, I think that means they put organ and guitar on one track and drums and bass on another track. Or maybe if the bass was overdubbed, they'd bounce it down. I'm not sure. And Jim on a third track, and that would leave one open for overdubs.
Well, I noticed that the panning was pretty consistently organ and drums on the left side. I don't know if that
Mhm.
means they were on the same track or not, or if that meant that they were on different tracks. But I don't know.
It's possible they switched it
Consistently
up
panning
based on the
pretty well.
I
song.
mean, even if they overdubbed the vocals, right? Or like even on some of the songs, like yeah, you're right, Rob. Like it's only gonna leave one track, right? So
Yeah.
and that's difficult in a bounce down scenario, right? There's nowhere to bounce down to. So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, exactly. Well, as long as you leave one track open, you could bounce down. But I didn't really hear about a lot of bounces. I don't think there are that many overdubs on this. It's typically
I'm sorry.
limited.
I live in this world. I live in 2024 now, and I just think of everything as stereo. I just think like, oh, I just have limitless tracks. Everything's stereo.
Of course.
Yeah. But no.
The producer they end up working with is a guy called Paul Rothschild, who also ended up working with Janis Joplin on Me and Bobby McGee, and supposedly even produced the very first CSN demo, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, that helped them land their original recording contract. So I was looking into Sunset Sound, the place where they recorded this. It had one of the very first vocal isolation booths. This is part of what made it so that they could record the vocals live but not have bleed. Because if you listen to that vocal track, it does feel really fresh and crisp. So imagine Jim's in his own little room with a window back to the larger room where the band is playing. So they are making eye contact, but he's technically in sound isolation. That's how they tracked all the tunes.
I definitely noticed that the reverb specifically on the vocal is it's just lush and gorgeous, and it really does feel almost like part of the band. I mean, this is common of like stuff of this era. Like the reverb is just so great. And yeah, I think that ISO booth makes sense, right? Because you hear it isolated onto the vocals in like a bold way, where the rest of the thing just sounds like a band kind of cooking.
Yeah. I also have to say I really liked the way that the vocals were produced, especially with when they double the vocals,
Hmm.
which they do kind of frequently. And it's probably an artifact again of not having a whole lot of headroom on the tape to do just shitloads of takes and tracks, but it's very often clearly imprecise doubling of Jim on Jim, and it still sounds really good. It's got a fresh, cool sound to it, and I have to assume that they kind of just leaned into that this is a performance-based kind of delivery, and so just give two performances, we'll lay them on top of each other, and if it sounds good, it
Well,
sounds
if
good.
you think about it too, right? If you're in a scenario like that where you're so limited on tracks, it's not unreasonable that they sent him into the booth and made him sing one live with the other one rolling, and then would listen back to the one that dumped both onto it. And we're like, keep it, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
because
Yeah, it could
they're
be.
gonna need that track, right?
Well, I think two things to comment on what we're talking about. One is I do think the existence of the vocal isolation booth gives this record a more forward sounding quality. Whereas I think other records produced in the 60s sometimes suffer from something about the vocal not being as crisp. And this, Jim almost comes off, and I think it highlights his vocal talent in particular, because he's kind of more of a crooner than anything else. He has a little bit of a Frank Sinatra element to him, right? Which might be surprising based on the disparity in their actual music. But second, they wanted a live sound. They liked the idea that there weren't a lot of overdubs. Keep in mind that they had been night after night working on what the band sounded like, and they were trying to, on stage, that is, and they were trying to recreate that in the studio, more or less. Okay, so da, 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 da. All right, yeah, so we mentioned, right, that they had the forethought to hire a bass player for the sessions. He went uncredited on the original release. He's on Wikipedia now, but the Fender Rhodes bass piano was great for the live show, but it didn't quite have the low end sound or the pop that the producer wanted. So they bring in this guy, Larry Knechtel, who's part of the Wrecking Crew. He comes in and he overdubs a bass on every track. Like we said before, aping just what Ray did normally in the live show, or I can't see how they did it with the tracks, but possibly like Ray laid it down first and then he did it. I'm not 100% sure how that
Dude,
happened.
those Wrecking Crew guys can do anything. So I'm
Yeah,
sure
I
that
feel
it was
like
just
they must
like,
have been doing some really risky stuff. I mean, maybe you like double the tape or something, but I imagine they're just like, we're just gonna print this right on top of these four tracks.
Right.
Just,
This dude can handle it. Yeah.
yeah, he probably was like, give me one time without recording it to play it, and then record it the second time, and I'm done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'll be fine. And then give
Speaking
me
of
like
these wrecking,
$20 and I'll go.
Yeah.
Speaking of these Wrecking Crew guys basically being able to do anything. So one, this guy also played bass on the Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man, but even weirder, the dude played piano on Bridge Over Troubled Water.
Ooh,
That's a
see?
beautiful piano take for
That's what I'm
a bass
saying. These
player.
Wrecking Crew guys can do anything. They are the cream of the crop when it comes to rock and studio musicians. They are killers.
So the whole thing took 2 weeks to record. This is in August of 1966. It takes 5 weeks to mix, which is kind of a long time. I think it's because the band wanted to be there for the mixing sessions. Maybe they couldn't agree on some things. I mean, given how few tracks there were, that seems like a long time.
Maybe Jim just didn't show up a whole lot.
He
Or was-
probably did not. And
Yeah.
speaking of that, Jim was unsurprisingly into method performing. He was really into getting into the zone to record these tunes. And he would take acid before the studio.
No way.
Hey,
Yes.
practice how you play, as they say. If you're gonna-
Well, they did. The producer did say that they tried to do a whole day's worth of the end, and they couldn't get it because Jim was too blitzed on acid. He was like, "I can't. You got to come back not on acid. That's the only way."
you have to come back on less acid.
But after a particularly fruitful and exciting day of tracking, in fact, the one where they ended up getting the final take for the end, he managed that night to break back into the studio and decided to douse the entire tracking area with a fire extinguisher because he needed to, quote, quench the fire they had lit in the studio that day.
What a fucking asshole. God
So
damn.
I know they get back in the next day. They find it covered in foam. Now, everyone close to the band kind of immediately senses what happened, but Jim-
Yeah, it was Jim.
Jim never faced any consequences. They just kind of rolled over with the studio owners, like, oh, yeah, it must have been vandals or kids or something. They didn't damage the mixing board or the really expensive stuff in the control room. So I think that's part of what made it okay. But that's just an example of what a insane person he is.
I see.
So, yeah, kids, don't do that. That won't go over well.
Generally speaking, you will end up having to pay $20,000 plus in damages.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bad idea. So now, before the record even came out, Elektra felt like they had something big. They kind of knew they had something on the tape. The band felt really good about it too. And Elektra, the record label, sprung for a billboard, a huge billboard on Sunset Boulevard, advertising the record. This was actually a first, but it ended up setting a precedent for big album releases for like the next 30 years. That was the thing to do. Now,
Let me ask you a question.
sure.
As a percentage, how much of that billboard was Jim Morrison's face? It's got to be 80%, right?
How much was his chest? Yeah.
Oh, maybe that too.
It's funny because they talked about at some point, probably after this was released, and it was starting to become a success. They talked in the book I read about the photo shoot, and they were just describing Jim Morrison. They called it the lion shot, and I was like, oh yeah, I immediately know the photograph you're talking about. Very memorable. I think it was on the Doors' Greatest Hits album.
Yeah. I had that one growing up. That was my introduction to the Doors. And also, we're going to talk about the actual songs later, but I definitely was like, God damn, there's a lot of songs from this first album on that Greatest Hits.
Yeah,
They really did pack some hits in here.
they did. And you know what else is an interesting detail I found out? The band shared writing and publishing credit equally across the board throughout their career. That was a very savvy decision.
Yeah, it's a very. I feel like it's
For
them and the
John
Red Hot
Densmore,
Chili
definitely.
Peppers, right?
It could have meant they could have gone on for decades, but unfortunately that did not happen. Actually, another funny thing I realized, and we're not going to talk about Jim Morrison's death, is do you know that they did record 2 more albums without Jim Morrison?
They did. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Were
Didn't-
they released?
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, the first
Are
one is
there
called Other Voices.
Are there other voices, or is it just
Yeah,
instrumental?
I think it's Ray Manzarek singing. Yeah.
didn't Krieger and Manzarek try to make themselves like the 20th century Doors at one point? And then they got Jesus, kitten, shut up. Sorry.
Tom hates cats.
I love my cat, but he's fucking loud. All right. No, at one point, Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek formed I think they called themselves like the New Century Doors or the 20th Century Doors, and they were trying to play. And then they got sued, and then they were like, "Oh, I know. We'll just call ourselves Krieger and Manzarek, and everyone will come see us because we all know exactly what the appeal of the Doors was." And unsurprisingly, I don't think that project lasted very long.
I mean, obviously he's a very difficult guy to replace, but I'm even thinking about these other bands, Queen with Paul Rogers, or like things that have been reasonably successful getting a replacement, but maybe
AC/DC.
acknowledging that it's a replacement. But
Mm.
with this, who could you even get? Like, how would it even
Yeah,
work?
yeah.
Nah.
You just gotta find a hobo and be like, listen, man, I'm gonna teach you how to sing. All right.
I'm
How
gonna put in the work.
on a scale
It
of one to
starts on
ten,
the
how into
rooftop.
drugs?
Yeah, yeah. Here's 270 hits of acid. I'll be back in 91 days. If you're still alive, you're in the band.
Oh man. Okay, so the album gets released January 4th, 1967. Again, it's pretty early in the pantheon of music changing. This is pre Sgt. Pepper's, for instance, and which came out later in 1967. Now, nowadays, I can report that the album sold over 13 million copies, but it did not become a hit right away. The first single was Break On Through, which we played at the top of the show. It was released right before the album came out, like days before. It slowly became a local hit in LA, and that's where they kind of had a following anyway from all the shows they played, but it never cracked the Hot 100. It topped out at 106. Instead, it wasn't until the second single, Light My Fire, got released in April of 67. And as the summer heat came on, it started to pick up some steam. Late night DJs were getting requests to play it, but standard daytime radio stations could not play a 7-minute song. So they asked the band to chop it down to a single, which they did, and it climbed the charts from there. They say the summer heat was a factor, but also this summer there was a lot of civil unrest. There were riots breaking out in a few American cities, fires being set, and DJs, for better or worse, kind of leaned into that aspect when they were playing the song.
I have to say, it very clearly is an inferior song to Break On Through. Like Light My Fire is not a terrible song, but if I was putting the two of them up against each other, I can clearly see why the band chose Break On Through
Oh,
as their debut single.
I mean,
Absolutely.
we'll get to it, the song in a second, but it's a really great like song one, track one. Like,
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, great first, second, or two of
Well,
your sound.
I agree. Well, we chose not to talk about Light My Fire kind of for that reason, because I thought that was one of the blander offerings, even though it is iconic, but it does become their first number one hit and Elektra's first ever number one hit. The Doors, the album, starts selling that summer. It culminates perhaps in them going on the Ed Sullivan Show in September of 1967 and being asked to change the Girl We Couldn't Get Much Higher lyric. They agree to it in the backstage area, and then they sing it loud and proud instead on live TV, which is sort of an iconic moment in rock and roll, and I think it actually gets referred to quite a lot.
That was the one that was spoofed on The Simpsons, right?
Definitely.
Yeah,
What I
yeah. What I want is I want to hug and kiss you.
right,
Yeah.
It's much better, yeah.
yeah, exactly. But I also saw it, maybe this is rampant speculation from someone who wasn't there at the time, but it also seems like a great torch passing moment. When the Beatles went on Sullivan just 3 years before, it was the hottest thing going. And I'd imagine the Beatles wouldn't have dreamed of getting themselves banned, which is what happened to the Doors immediately, right? But the Doors didn't care. And in part, that was, of course, because of their general rebellious attitude. But it was also because the culture was moving on from dinosaur variety shows like Ed Sullivan.
Yeah.
Like, it just wasn't the thing anymore. So who even cares?
Well, the Stones famously on, I believe it was on Ed Sullivan, did Let's Spend Some Time Together instead of Let's Spend the
Yeah,
Night
yeah,
Together.
Oh, yeah.
And that's kind of seen as, bowing down. And again,
Not punk.
yeah, definitely not punk. I have heard two versions of the story. One is that Jim Morrison was like, fuck you, I'm going to sing these lyrics because, they mean a lot to me. And the other one was that he just fucking forgot because he was fucking drunk as shit. And he's
Both
just like,
plausible.
yeah. And also both punk.
Yeah, the other thing I learned this week, again, we're not going to talk about Light My Fire in the song section that's coming up, is that Robbie Krieger wrote the majority of Light My Fire. He brought it to the group. Jim, I think, contributed the lyrics to the second verse, but basically it was their whole cloth. And because of that, and because it was a major hit that audiences wanted to hear every single night consistently and called out for, Jim was such a pouty bitch about it.
No, I
Because
cannot
one of
imagine
the
that.
songs that people liked was not written by him.
Well, that's the read on it.
Maybe
Yeah.
the first big hit
The
was not
first
written
big
by him.
hit, and then one they were known for a fair amount of time after this.
So he contributed the second verse. The time to hesitate is through. No time to wallow in the mire. The one that just takes it from like a kind of love song, because the rest of it's like, girl, we couldn't get much high. Come on, it's kind of poppy. And then you
Yeah.
get to the second verse, and he's like, "I'm gonna fucking burn your body." Like, okay, Jim.
Yeah, very Jim. Okay, last detail before we get to the songs. The Doors' debut record at this point is a hit. They're out on the road, breaking a bunch of rules as they go. We are going to stop the story here to leave some meat on the bone, like I said, for our future episodes about more of their releases. But just to close things out, in case anyone listening happens to not know, they go on to make a handful more records in the next couple of years. They have a more successful hit singles. They toured the world, but sadly, Jim Morrison dies in Paris in 1971 at age 27. Official cause of death is heart failure, but definitely drugs and or alcohol were involved. He's a part of the so-called 27 Club, along with Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, and others.
So this just the context on that is a little crazy. That's 4 years from you release your first album. I guess 4.5 years from you release your first album to you have drank yourself to death before you hit 30. That's gotta have been a wild
Well,
ride, man.
they sort of cover it in the movie too, how like they burned so hot, but then like fell off, like they weren't invited to Woodstock. So like they would have put this record out in what, 67, and then they're
Yep.
not invited to Woodstock, 2.5 years later.
Yeah,
Now maybe
and
there's more to it than that. Maybe it's maybe the band wasn't working. Maybe Jim was lost in the desert. Maybe there are more reasons that they weren't at that event.
well, I think we'll probably get into it when we talk about those later records
Sure.
because the two other records that are on the list, just as a quick summary, are the follow-up record to this, which it seems from reading the book that most of the songs on that were pretty much also worked out at this point, and they recorded it shortly after. So it's a very similar sounding record, even though it wasn't quite as popular. And
Strange Days.
that's Strange Days. And the last record, LA Woman, which was released shortly before Morrison's death. And in between, they had several records, but I think struggled with trying to change the formula. And, there was definitely a dip in how they were seen. Okay, you want to talk about some songs?
Yeah.
Let's do it.